The courthouse lobby was a bustle of anxious energy. Attorneys in tailored suits glided across the polished marble floors, their expressions stern or preoccupied. Plaintiffs, defendants, and family members sat in stiff wooden benches, shifting every so often to stretch their tired backs. Clerks scurried with thick folders, their shoes tapping out nervous rhythms echoing in the high-vaulted ceilings. Among these professionals, there was a palpable sense of routine. Most of them had been here hundreds of times, after all. But for Catherine Fairchild, it was only the third time she had ever stepped into a courtroom. She stood at the edge of the lobby, feeling conspicuously out of place. Her palm was clammy as she clutched a single manila folder containing all the documents she thought she needed. Her financial statements, text messages, screenshots of emails, and a list of personal belongings she hoped to retrieve in the divorce proceedings. The swirl of activity around her felt surreal. She thought, not for the first time that morning, that the system was designed not for clarity but for confusion. She wondered if the sense of disorientation was strategic. Taking a deep breath, Catherine looked at the large clock that hung over the entrance to the hallway. It was 9:20, her hearing would begin in 10 minutes. 10 minutes to gather her composure, to brace herself for what she knew would be the fight of her life. She tried to calm her breathing. Her hair, a deep auburn, was secured in a neat chignon at the nape of her neck. She wore a simple charcoal gray skirt suit, the best she could afford after months of financial strain. On the outside, she tried to appear poised, if only to conceal the anxiety within. When she finally walked toward the correct courtroom, she caught sight of a tall, imposing figure engaged in what appeared to be a light-hearted conversation with the clerk. This was Maxwell Brown, the high-profile attorney representing her soon-to-be ex-husband, Julian Fairchild. He was known throughout the city for his merciless cross-examinations, charismatic presence, and at times unscrupulous legal maneuvers. He wore a pristine navy suit, a power tie the color of wine, and black leather shoes so polished that they reflected the overhead fluorescent lights. Maxwell was grinning in a way that Catherine found unsettling. There was something wolfish in his smile, something that suggested he was always a step ahead. He seemed too comfortable, too confident, especially considering the gravity of what was about to occur in front of the judge. Rumor had it that Maxwell prided himself on winning divorces for his wealthy clients with minimal payouts and maximum humiliation for the opposing side. Catherine felt her stomach knot at the mere sight of him. As Catherine approached, Maxwell turned his gaze to her. His eyes, dark and calculating, flickered over her appearance. For an instant, his lips curled into an almost imperceptible smirk. She recognized it immediately as the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he already had the upper hand. She had no lawyer of her own. She had tried to find representation, but her limited resources and Julian's cunning manipulations had made that nearly impossible. Ultimately, she had decided, quite reluctantly, to represent herself. It was not so much a decision as it was a forced situation. She simply couldn't afford counsel. Inside, she reminded herself she was doing this for her future, for her freedom. She had endured years of emotional turmoil, feeling suffocated by the marriage. By the time she discovered her husband's secrets, part financial, part deeply personal, she knew she had to break away. Still, she never imagined that their once passionate love would come to this. An acrimonious court battle with a ruthless attorney poised to destroy her credibility and deprive her of what little she had left. She slipped past Maxwell without making eye contact. The hallway leading to the courtroom had a window on one side, revealing a parking lot lined with cars. She paused briefly, pressing her hand against the glass. The morning light was a bright, unrelenting glare, making her blink a few times as she stared at the rows of vehicles. Something about that mundane sight gave her a small sense of grounding. Ordinary people were outside, living ordinary lives. She wanted to rejoin them, to find normalcy again. But first, there was a battle to face. She stepped into the courtroom. The space was neither large nor small, but it felt imposing with its dark wood paneling and the raised bench for the judge. A meticulously carved state seal was displayed behind the judge's seat, reminding everyone of the power and gravity of the law. The rows of pew-like benches behind the counsel tables were mostly empty at this hour, save for a few individuals awaiting their own hearings. A bailiff stood near the door, scanning the faces of everyone who entered. Catherine took a seat at the respondents' table, trying to organize her thoughts and her documents. She noticed Maxwell Brown chatting amicably with Julian a few feet away. Julian was tall and conventionally handsome, with slick-back hair and a crisp dark suit. His posture was relaxed, as if he were merely chatting with an acquaintance at a country club. Catherine couldn't help but recall when that easy confidence had once attracted her. In those days, she'd considered it a charming sign of his self-assuredness. Now it was a chilling reflection of arrogance. She was so lost in her thoughts that she almost didn't notice the bailiff announcing the arrival of Judge Eleanora Wright. The entire courtroom rose as the judge, a stately woman in her early 60s, walked in, her black robe rustling. She had a reputation for fairness, a calm demeanor, and a fierce dislike for theatrics. Her short, silver hair was impeccably styled, and her sharp eyes surveyed the courtroom with a keen attentiveness. Once everyone was seated, the clerk proceeded through the docket, calling each case one by one. Catherine's case was in the middle of the list. Each time the clerk announced a name, Catherine's heart gave a little jump, only to slow down as she realized it wasn't hers. Finally, the clerk called out, "Fairchild vs. Fairchild." That single statement set the stage for the ordeal Catherine had dreaded for months. She stood up, feeling her nerves fray, and took her place at the table designated for her as the respondent, since Julian had technically filed first. On the other side, Maxwell Brown and Julian Fairchild approached their table with a composed, almost leisurely stride. Judge Wright adjusted her glasses, looking from Maxwell to Catherine. "Good morning," the judge said. "We're here to address the divorce proceedings for Mr. Julian Fairchild and Mrs. Catherine Fairchild. First, I understand that the petitioner has counsel, Mr. Maxwell Brown. Ms. Fairchild, do you have representation here today?" Catherine cleared her throat. "No, Your Honor, I'm representing myself." Judge Wright's expression softened slightly, though she maintained professional neutrality. "All right, we'll take this carefully, step by step. I'm aware there are allegations of financial impropriety as well as disputes over property division and spousal maintenance. We'll address each in turn. Let's begin with the financial disclosures, shall we?" Maxwell rose with an easy confidence. "Thank you, Your Honor. If it pleases the court, we would like to submit the petitioner's financial statement and a summary of the joint assets. We believe this will clarify the matter at hand and demonstrate that Ms. Fairchild's claim for spousal support is unfounded, based on gross misrepresentations of the couple's finances." Immediately, Catherine felt a flush in her cheeks. She knew Maxwell would come out swinging. She braced herself, recalling the advice from the few lawyers she'd managed to consult with for quick phone calls. "Always remain calm, do not let him provoke you." Yet, even as she repeated that mantra, her frustration simmered beneath the surface. Judge Wright nodded and motioned for Maxwell to proceed. "Very well, Mr. Brown." He handed a thick file to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. Catherine watched as Judge Wright skimmed through the documents. Maxwell continued, "Your Honor, my client has made every effort to be transparent about his assets, income, and liabilities. As you will see from the bank statements and investment portfolios, Mr. Fairchild's earnings are substantial, yes, but they are also highly variable, given that he operates multiple businesses that rely on fluctuating market conditions. The notion that my client is hiding any significant assets, as Ms. Fairchild insinuates, is simply untrue." Now it was Catherine's turn. She rose to her feet, clearing her throat once more. "I have here," she said, lifting her own folder, "documents that show wire transfers from our joint account to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. These are accounts I never had knowledge of until recently. I also have correspondences that indicate Mr. Fairchild was negotiating real estate purchases in London under a shell corporation. Again, none of this was disclosed to me. It wasn't until I did my own digging that I stumbled onto it." Judge Wright raised an eyebrow, momentarily halting her perusal of the documents Maxwell had presented. She looked at Catherine. "Do you have these documents ready for submission?" "Yes, Your Honor," Catherine said. Her voice wavered slightly, but she pushed through her nerves. She walked over and handed the file to the bailiff, who passed it up to the bench. Maxwell cast Catherine a cool glance, the ghost of a condescending smile playing on his lips. "Your Honor, I would caution against forming conclusions too hastily. We believe these so-called shell corporations are nothing more than legitimate business ventures that Ms. Fairchild was not privy to because they fell outside the scope of their marital partnership. Legally, my client is entitled to acquire assets using his own personal funds, which he did." Catherine felt anger surge through her. "But these weren't personal funds, Mr. Brown. They were funneled from our joint account. That's what all the wire transfer documentation shows." For a moment, Maxwell's mask of confidence slipped, revealing a glint of something that might have been contempt. "Your Honor, we will address each of these allegations systematically. My client is prepared to prove that every single transfer was either a business expense or an investment that he had every right to make. Frankly, Ms. Fairchild's grasp of financial matters is limited. She may be misunderstanding the nature of these transactions." There it was, the condescending remark Catherine had anticipated. The pointed implication that she was just a confused ex-wife who didn't understand the complexities of her husband's finances. She gritted her teeth. Judge Wright narrowed her eyes slightly. "Let's hold off on the characterizations for now. This is a preliminary hearing, not a trial. I see that there is a significant dispute over the division of assets, so we will need more time to examine all these documents thoroughly. For today, I need to ascertain whether there is any immediate financial relief warranted, especially given Ms. Fairchild's claim that she has been left with minimal resources. Maxwell clasped his hands in front of him, exuding the air of a patient teacher addressing a novice. Your Honor, my client is more than willing to provide temporary spousal support, but only to the extent that is reasonable and reflective of Ms. Fairchild's actual needs. We believe she has exaggerated her financial situation. Catherine's head shot up. Exaggerated? I'm barely paying my rent right now. I've had to move into a small apartment on the outskirts of town because all our joint accounts were frozen, pending this very proceeding. Maxwell made a soft, derisive sound, halfway between a sigh and a chuckle. It's hardly an undesirable living situation, Miss Fairchild. Many people live in apartments and manage just fine. Catherine's eyes flashed with indignation, but before she could retort, Judge Wright intervened. All right, let's not devolve into personal attacks. This court will not tolerate disrespect from either side. Mr. Brown, keep your remarks measured. Ms. Fairchild, focus on the facts. Understood. Both parties nodded, with Maxwell offering a smooth, "Of course, Your Honor." The judge then turned her attention fully to Catherine. Ms. Fairchild, can you detail your current monthly expenses and your immediate concerns? Catherine nodded, rifling through her folder to find the budget outline she had meticulously prepared. Yes, Your Honor, my rent is $1,500 a month. Utilities run about $200 depending on usage. Groceries and basic necessities cost me around $300 a month, sometimes more. I also have a car payment of $400 and health insurance premiums. Altogether, I need roughly $2,500 per month to cover basic living expenses. Right now, I'm making roughly $1,000 a month from a part-time office job. I had to leave my previous position because it was tied to my husband's company, and things became quite hostile during our separation. Maxwell took a step forward. Your Honor, while we sympathize with Ms. Fairchild's situation, we believe she has the capacity to find full-time employment with her qualifications. She holds a bachelor's degree in business administration, does she not? She also has multiple professional references, including my client, who generously funded her lifestyle for years. Catherine's cheeks burned. She hated how Maxwell spun everything to place her in a negative light. I've been applying for full-time positions, she countered. It's not that easy to find something flexible enough to accommodate the court dates and everything else going on. Judge Wright glanced from Catherine to Maxwell. Given the immediate needs here and the complexities of this case, I'm inclined to grant Ms. Fairchild some form of temporary spousal support until we can sort out the final distribution. This is standard practice. Mr. Fairchild has the financial means, correct? Maxwell's expression remained neutral, though Catherine sensed his annoyance. Yes, Your Honor, we will comply with any order the court deems appropriate. However, we request that it be a modest sum reflective of actual need rather than the lavish lifestyle Ms. Fairchild may be accustomed to. Judge Wright made a few notes. Let's set the temporary support at $2,000 per month. We'll revisit the amount at the next hearing. Now, if there's nothing else pressing on the financial front, I'd like to address the property division. Ms. Fairchild, you mentioned certain personal belongings you have yet to retrieve from the marital home. Catherine nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and fatigue. Yes, Your Honor, there's a collection of art pieces I inherited from my mother. They were stored in our basement, and now Julian is refusing to let me retrieve them. I also have sentimental items, photographs, family heirlooms, things I had before we got married. Maxwell spread his hands in a gesture of feigned innocence. Your Honor, my client has never barred Ms. Fairchild from collecting her personal items. The only issue is that many items she claims are personally hers may actually be jointly acquired during the marriage or, in some cases, my client's property. Ms. Fairchild left the marital home of her own accord and, as we understand it, took what she believed was rightfully hers. If she overlooked anything, my client is more than willing to arrange a convenient time for her to come by and pick up those items. Catherine could feel her frustration mounting. That's not true. I've tried on multiple occasions to coordinate with Julian to pick up my mother's art pieces, but he's always too busy or out of town, or claims the house is being renovated. Maxwell's smirk was back, albeit faint. Ms. Fairchild, perhaps your requests lacked clarity. We see no emails or texts from you that specify these items. Do you have proof of communication? Catherine clenched her fists discreetly. She knew Maxwell would resort to this tactic, claiming she had insufficient evidence. Yes, I have emails and text messages asking about the art pieces. They're in my file. Judge Wright lifted a hand. Let's not bicker. Submit the copies of your communications, Ms. Fairchild. I will instruct Mr. Fairchild to grant you access to retrieve items that are demonstrably yours. If there is a dispute about ownership, we will address it carefully, possibly with a neutral third party or through an itemized list that both sides must verify. Her gavel tapped gently. I'd like both sides to collaborate on a list of contested items. Next, we'll move on to the matter of the prenuptial agreement. It is my understanding there was one correct. Maxwell answered quickly, Indeed, Your Honor. My client and Ms. Fairchild signed a prenuptial agreement prior to their marriage, which clearly outlines the division of assets in the event of a divorce. We will be introducing that agreement and relying on it heavily in this case. Catherine's face tightened. The prenuptial agreement was something she deeply regretted signing. At the time, she had been swept up in the romance and the promise of a secure future. Julian had framed it as a mere formality, something his attorney recommended given his burgeoning wealth. She had trusted him. In retrospect, she realized how naive she had been. She had no legal representation of her own at the time and was not fully aware of the implications. Now Maxwell was poised to use that document as a hammer to weaken her claims. She realized, however, that there might be grounds to challenge its validity. She remembered from one of her brief consultations with a lawyer that if she could prove she signed under duress or without informed consent, the agreement could be invalidated, or if she could show that the document was grossly one-sided to the point of unconscionability. Judge Wright looked at Catherine. Ms. Fairchild, do you acknowledge this prenuptial agreement? Yes, I do, Your Honor, Catherine said. But I contend that it may not be enforceable because I had no legal advice or representation when I signed it, and I wasn't fully aware of its implications at the time. Maxwell jumped in. Your Honor, Ms. Fairchild had ample opportunity to consult with an attorney before signing. She chose not to. My client even offered to pay for a separate attorney for her, but she refused, wanting to expedite the wedding date. That was her decision. Catherine leveled her gaze at Maxwell. That's not accurate. Julian rushed me to sign it just days before our wedding, and I never saw an attorney's offer in writing. Judge Wright tapped a pen on the desk. All right, it seems this is another area that will require extensive review. The court will need to examine the circumstances around the signing of the prenup. This is not something we can conclude today. We will set a future date for a hearing specifically on the prenuptial agreement's enforceability. Until then, the existing agreement stands, but its final validity will remain in question. Catherine exhaled shakily. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a defeat either. She had at least bought herself time and the possibility that the prenup might be deemed void or amended. After reviewing a few more minor procedural points, Judge Wright adjourned the hearing for the day. We'll reconvene next month to delve deeper into these financial matters, the property division, and the prenuptial agreement. In the meantime, Mr. Fairchild will provide Ms. Fairchild with the court-ordered temporary support. Ms. Fairchild, be sure to submit any additional evidence of undisclosed assets to the court and opposing counsel. Court is adjourned. With a decisive crack of the gavel, everyone began to gather their belongings. Catherine felt a swirl of emotions, relief that she had survived the day, apprehension about what was to come, and a simmering anger at Maxwell's dismissive attitude. She saw Julian flash her a brief glance that seemed almost pitying, and it fueled her resolve. She would not be pitied nor mocked, not anymore. As she walked toward the exit, Maxwell sauntered over, a confident half-smile still on his face. That went about as I expected, he said. Good luck with the next hearing, Ms. Fairchild. You'll need it if you plan to challenge that prenup. She met his gaze squarely. I don't need luck, Mr. Brown, I just need the truth to come out. He gave a short laugh as if she'd made a naive remark. Truth is malleable in court, Ms. Fairchild. It depends on who presents it better, and I'm very good at my job. He strode away, leaving Catherine standing by the heavy wooden doors that led into the hallway. For a moment, she let his words wash over her. Then, with a resolute set to her jaw, she turned and exited the courtroom, ready to start preparing for the battles to come. Outside, the sunshine seemed almost too bright after the dim, controlled environment of the courtroom. She made her way down the steps, passing by a pair of reporters who seemed more interested in a criminal case. Nobody cared about her routine divorce hearing, but that was likely to change, she suspected, once certain facts came to light. Julian was a high-profile figure in the city's business community, and if the rumor mill ever picked up on the drama of his divorce, it could become a public spectacle. Catherine paused at the base of the courthouse steps, inhaling deeply. She glanced at her phone. She had dozens of messages from well-meaning friends asking how it went. She wasn't ready to reply yet. She just wanted a moment of quiet reflection. Within a few minutes, she forced herself to walk to her car. It was an older sedan, the back seat piled with paperwork and personal items she'd been carting around. She sank into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the courthouse parking lot. The tension in her muscles refused to release. She knew she had to decompress, but the thought of everything she needed to do churned in her mind. She had to gather more evidence about Julian's hidden assets. She needed to prepare a coherent timeline of events surrounding the prenup. She had to find a better job or at least some additional freelance work to shore up her finances. And above all, she had to stay emotionally strong in the face of Maxwell Brown's relentless attacks. One hearing was done, but many more were likely to follow, each one an opportunity for Maxwell to tear her apart. Back at her apartment, a modest one-bedroom unit in a mid-rise building, Catherine fumbled with the keys until she managed to unlock her door. She stepped inside, momentarily overwhelmed by the sheer normalcy of her life outside court. The place was tidy if a bit sparsely furnished. A small sofa faced a modest TV, and a bookshelf stood against the wall, filled with a mix of novels and legal self-help guides she'd been studying. She set down her folder on the coffee table and sank onto the couch. The quiet enveloped her like a blanket. For a few moments, she did nothing but stare at the ceiling, letting the tension in her shoulders ease. Then her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her reverie. It was a text from her friend Angela. "How did it go? Call me when you can." Catherine typed a quick response, "Not great, not terrible, we'll fill you in later." She threw her phone aside, deciding she needed a shower and maybe a quick nap before she tackled the day's tasks. But as soon as she tried to wind down, her mind churned again, replaying Maxwell's smug expressions, Julian's relaxed confidence, and the judge's measured tone. "He's very good at his job," Maxwell had said. She had no doubt about that. But Catherine wasn't going to let that intimidate her. She had to be equally prepared, more so if she wanted to stand a chance. 2 days later, Catherine found herself sitting in a cramped corner of the public library. She had come here, laptop in tow, to research case law regarding prenuptial agreements and asset disclosure rules in divorce proceedings. The hushed ambience and the quiet hum of the air conditioning created a soothing background. Stacks of books on various legal topics surrounded her, and she had a tall cup of coffee sweating on the wooden table. She typed keywords into the library's database: prenuptial agreement enforcement, hidden assets divorce, spousal support precedents, undue influence. She clicked through article after article, case after case, trying to piece together the puzzle of her legal strategy. The complexity was daunting. She wasn't a lawyer, she didn't want to be, but she had no choice now. Either she educated herself or she let Maxwell Brown steamroll her in court. At times, she became lost in a labyrinth of legal jargon. Words like fiduciary duty, statutory guidelines, and amicus brief made her eyes glaze over. But she pressed on, determined. She took meticulous notes in a worn spiral notebook, making bullet points of potential arguments and relevant precedents. After 2 hours, she took a short break to stretch her legs. As she wandered among the shelves, she spotted a familiar figure. An older man with graying hair and a slight stoop stood scanning the titles in the same legal section. She did a double take. It was Mr. Royce, a former attorney who had retired several years ago. She recognized him from a community talk he once gave at a local center. She recalled that he had specialized in family law and was known for his integrity. Impulsively, she decided to approach him. "Mr. Royce," she said, softly so as not to disturb others, "I'm sorry to bother you, but you're Charles Royce, right?" He turned, squinting at her through wire-rimmed glasses. "Yes, that's me. Do I know you?" "We haven't met formally," Catherine admitted, "but I attended a workshop you gave a couple of years ago on legal rights in family disputes." His expression brightened with recognition. "Ah, yes, I did give a few talks around town." He glanced at the books in her arms and the pages of notes. "Doing some research." Catherine nodded. "I'm representing myself in a divorce case. My husband, well, ex-husband-to-be, has an aggressive attorney, and I'm trying to figure out how to defend myself." Mr. Royce's brows knitted. "That's a tough situation. Have you tried to get representation, legal aid maybe?" She sighed. "I've tried. No one wants to go up against my husband's lawyer, Maxwell Brown, on a contingency basis, and I don't have the funds to pay a retainer out of pocket. They all say I have a decent case, but not a guaranteed slam dunk, so it's risky." Mr. Royce nodded sympathetically. "Yes, Maxwell Brown has quite a reputation, but he's not unbeatable." Catherine found herself encouraged by that simple statement. "I've been poring over case law, trying to see if I can find something to counter him. It's overwhelming." He gave her a warm smile. "It is, especially without formal training, but you can use that to your advantage. You can present yourself as someone who is just seeking justice, not playing the typical legal game. Judges sometimes appreciate honesty and sincerity, especially in family law cases. He hesitated, seeming to weigh a decision. I'm retired, but if you want, I could look over some of your paperwork. I can't represent you formally, but I can offer a bit of guidance. Her relief was palpable. That would be incredible. I'd really appreciate any help at all. She explained her case briefly, highlighting the prenuptial agreement and the hidden assets. She handed him a short summary she'd typed out of the major points. He skimmed the pages, his eyes narrowing as he reached certain paragraphs. This is interesting. Off-the-books transfers, potential shell corporations, you might have more leverage than you realize, especially if you can prove he was commingling what he's calling personal funds with marital assets. He handed the summary back to her. I can meet you here again next week if you want. Bring everything you've got. Catherine beamed. Thank you so much, Mr. Royce, this means a lot. He gave a modest shrug. Just trying to help, and don't lose heart. Divorce proceedings can be long and painful, but they do end. The key is to keep your composure and know your facts inside and out. Catherine felt a renewed sense of hope. She thanked him again and returned to her research table. Maybe the scales weren't as stacked against her as she'd feared. With a bit of guidance, she might stand a chance. She sat back down, opened her laptop, and got back to work. Later that week, Catherine finally found time to visit the place she had once called home, the sprawling suburban mansion she had shared with Julian. She had arranged the visit with Maxwell's office to pick up her mother's artwork, though she doubted it would go smoothly. Standing at the wrought iron gate, she couldn't help but feel a wave of nostalgia. The house was large and stately, set back from the street, framed by manicured hedges and a fountain in the circular driveway. It had always felt more like Julian's domain than hers. She recalled how small she had felt there, especially in the latter months of their marriage when tensions ran high. The gate slowly opened, and she walked up the driveway, noticing that the garden had been meticulously kept, as if nothing had changed. The front door opened before she could knock, and a housekeeper greeted her politely, though not warmly. Inside, the foyer was bathed in natural light from the high windows. The marble floors gleamed, and the chandelier overhead sparkled. Everything smelled of lemon polish and fresh flowers. Catherine couldn't decide if she missed this place or loathed it, perhaps both. Mr. Fairchild is in the study, the housekeeper said, gesturing down a hallway. Catherine followed, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. She found Julian seated behind a large mahogany desk, scrolling through his phone. He looked up as she entered, and for a brief moment she thought she saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the familiar guarded arrogance. I'm here for my mother's paintings, Catherine said, getting straight to the point. Julian stood and gestured for her to sit, but she remained where she was. He sighed and walked around the desk. They're in the basement storage room. I had them wrapped in protective materials. Catherine resisted the urge to say something snide. Instead, she nodded. I appreciate that. He led the way down a flight of stairs to the basement. The storage room was spacious and climate-controlled, filled with racks of artwork and boxes. Catherine spotted the 3 paintings immediately, vibrant oils on canvas, each depicting a different coastal scene. They had belonged to her mother, a passionate collector of local art. For Catherine, these paintings were priceless, representing memories of her childhood home. Julian stepped aside, letting her examine them. I never meant to keep them from you, he said after a moment. She turned, skeptical. Then why the runaround every time I tried to arrange this visit? He shrugged, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his posture. The divorce is stressful. The lawyers advised me to be cautious about who comes onto the property. You know how it is. Catherine rolled her eyes. Maxwell is the one who told you that, I'm sure. Julian didn't deny it. He crossed his arms. You won't need a moving truck for these, will you? They should fit in my car, Catherine said. She carefully picked up one of the paintings, letting her fingers linger on the frame. Memories flooded her. The time her mother bought the painting at an art fair, the day Catherine helped her hang it in the living room. She swallowed hard, determined not to let Julian see any sign of vulnerability. He hesitated as if he wanted to say something more, then he cleared his throat. I'll help you carry them up. They moved in silence, transporting the paintings to her trunk. Once they were secured, Catherine turned to Julian. These belonged to my family long before we met, she said quietly. I just want to make sure you understand that. He nodded, looking oddly subdued. I do. I'm not trying to fight you on everything, Catherine. She met his gaze, searching for sincerity. Then why hire Maxwell Brown? He fights dirty, you know that. Julian looked away, running a hand through his hair. Because I can't afford to lose everything either. My businesses, my reputation, don't act like you don't know what's at stake for me. She exhaled, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. I'm not out to ruin you, Julian, I just want what's fair, and you know things weren't right. The secret accounts, the shell corporations, that's not a marriage based on trust. He stiffened, those were just business moves, you wouldn't understand. Catherine felt a flash of anger, because I'm not a business tycoon like you, right? He didn't reply, she shook her head and turned toward her car. I have what I came for, I'll see you in court. She got in, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. Her heart pounded with a mix of anger, sadness, and something like grief. She reminded herself that she was not the person she used to be. She was stronger now, or at least she was determined to become stronger, no matter what it took. Over the next few weeks, Catherine's life settled into a grueling routine, working at her part-time job during the day, then diving into legal research in the evenings. With Mr. Royce's informal guidance, she began to structure her evidence more effectively. She learned how to cross-reference bank statements, highlight discrepancies, and compile them into an organized binder. She drafted motions challenging the prenuptial agreement's fairness. She documented every communication with Julian and Maxwell, saving emails and texts in multiple formats. In her spare moments, she also worked on her mental and emotional health. She signed up for a yoga class at a local community center, finding that the controlled breathing and gentle stretches helped quell her anxiety. She went on occasional walks by the lake, letting the sound of the water calm her racing thoughts. Despite her best efforts, doubts sometimes crept in. Maxwell Brown's reputation was legendary. She'd heard horror stories from other women who had been left penniless by his tactics. She worried that no matter how hard she tried, she might fall into one of his legal traps. But every time fear threatened to paralyze her, she remembered what was at stake: her independence, her financial future, her very sense of self. One evening, as she was reviewing her notes in her cramped living room, she received a call from an unknown number. She answered warily. The voice on the other end was female, soft-spoken, and hesitant. "Hello, Ms. Fairchild," the voice asked. "This is Wendy Chu." Catherine racked her memory. She recognized the name but couldn't place it immediately. "Yes, this is Catherine. How can I help you?" I got your number from a mutual acquaintance. They told me you were divorcing Julian Fairchild. I used to work in his accounting department. Before that, I was a bookkeeper for one of his other companies. Catherine's pulse quickened. This could be significant. "Yes, that's correct. I'm in the middle of divorce proceedings right now. Is there something you want to talk about?" Wendy hesitated, the silence on the line heavy with meaning. "I'm not sure if I should be calling you, but I know some things about how Julian manages his finances. Things that, well, if you don't know about them, it could hurt your case. I just felt that I needed to reach out. Julian, he's done some things that aren't exactly legal." Catherine almost dropped the phone in surprise. "What do you mean?" "Well, for starters, he manipulates his balance sheets and revenue reports to hide profits offshore. I helped him set up some of those accounts." Wendy paused as if she was summoning courage. "I don't work for him anymore, and after I left, I felt really guilty. I got the sense that you might need someone to corroborate what's really happening with his finances." Catherine's breath caught. If Wendy had hard evidence and was willing to testify, this could blow the case wide open. "Wendy, I thank you for reaching out. Do you have documentation or anything concrete?" "Yes," Wendy said. "I still have some encrypted files. I was never completely comfortable with what he asked me to do, so I kept copies. But I'm worried about retaliation if I come forward. Maxwell Brown is ruthless, and Julian, well, you know how he can be." Catherine closed her eyes, overwhelmed by a surge of hope and fear. "I understand, this is huge. It could be very important for my case. But I don't want you to put yourself in danger." Wendy let out a shaky breath. "I feel like I owe it to myself to do the right thing. I don't want him to get away with this. I'm sure you can imagine how many people he's taken advantage of." Catherine nodded, though Wendy couldn't see her. "I appreciate your bravery. Let's handle this carefully. I'm working with a retired attorney who might be able to help advise us. Could we meet somewhere discreet, maybe discuss how to proceed safely?" They arranged to meet at a coffee shop the next day. After the call ended, Catherine sat there in stunned silence, the dial tone still ringing in her ears. This was the breakthrough she had hoped for but never imagined would come in such a direct way. Julian's entire empire could be at stake if Wendy's information was solid. It also posed new risks. She knew Maxwell Brown would do everything in his power to discredit Wendy, to intimidate or silence her if possible. Still, it was a glimmer of possibility that she desperately needed. She felt both exhilarated and terrified. If there was one thing Catherine knew, it was that when push came to shove, men like Julian and lawyers like Maxwell could be very dangerous if they felt cornered. The next day, Catherine arrived early at the designated coffee shop, a quaint spot with mismatched furniture and the comforting aroma of freshly brewed espresso. She chose a table in the back corner, far from the windows. Her hands were slightly sweaty as she nursed a cup of coffee, scanning every person who walked in. Finally, a woman in her late 20s with dark hair pulled into a low ponytail and large, anxious eyes stepped inside. She looked around uncertainly until Catherine waved her over. Wendy approached, clutching a tote bag tightly. "Wendy," Catherine asked softly. She nodded, sliding into the seat opposite Catherine. "I'm sorry if I seem jumpy, I'm just worried someone might be watching." Catherine offered a reassuring smile. "It's okay, I get it. Maxwell Brown can be intimidating, so can Julian, but we're in a public place and I doubt they know we're meeting." Wendy reached into her tote and pulled out a small flash drive. "This has the files I mentioned. Bank statements, emails, transaction records. I don't know if they're all relevant, but I think they show a pattern of funneling money. I haven't looked at them in detail since I left the company, but I remember the general contents." Catherine took the flash drive carefully as if it were a priceless artifact. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll make sure to keep this safe. May I ask, do you have any direct communications from Julian instructing you to misrepresent financial information?" Wendy nodded. He'd send instructions from a private email account, but sometimes from the official one too. He always thought he was too smart to get caught, or that people around him would keep quiet because they were too scared or too dependent on him. He was mostly right. "Why are you coming forward now?" Catherine asked, not with suspicion but genuine curiosity. Wendy cast her eyes downward. "I was an immigrant child from a family who believed in hard work and honesty. When I realized Julian was pulling these stunts, I felt sick about it, but I also needed the job. Eventually, the guilt ate at me. I left, but it wasn't enough. I want to do something to make it right." Catherine nodded, empathy washing over her. "I understand, and you're putting yourself at risk. I promise I'll do everything I can to protect your identity until it's absolutely necessary for you to come forward." Wendy looked relieved. "Thank you, that's all I ask. If you need me to testify, I will, but I want to do it in a way that minimizes blowback." They spoke a bit longer, discussing possible strategies. Catherine told her about Mr. Royce and how they could get an initial legal perspective without involving the court directly. Wendy agreed to an eventual meeting. After about half an hour, Wendy left and Catherine stayed to finish her coffee, her mind racing with possibilities. She felt the air around her crackle with a new intensity. This divorce was no longer just about property division or spousal support. It was about exposing the underbelly of Julian's empire, about revealing the lengths to which he would go to maintain his lavish lifestyle. Catherine's heart pounded as she imagined Maxwell's reaction when he found out. She was certain it would be explosive. That evening, Catherine wasted no time. She arranged a meeting with Mr. Royce at the library, explaining the broad strokes of what Wendy had given her. Mr. Royce arrived promptly, a serious expression on his face. When they settled at a private study table, Catherine handed him the flash drive. "The files are here. I haven't looked through everything yet. I thought it might be best to do it with you so you can explain the legal context." Mr. Royce nodded, inserting the drive into his laptop. They spent the next 2 hours scrolling through spreadsheets, emails, transaction logs, and other documentation. It was a dizzying amount of information, but certain lines stood out. Large sums of money transferred from official company accounts to personal ones, then routed offshore. Some of the emails included explicit instructions from Julian, referencing keeping the books clean or adjusting the reported revenue. "This is substantial," Mr. Royce muttered, half to himself. "If this is authentic, it's evidence not just of hidden marital assets but potentially of tax evasion and fraud." Catherine felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This could turn into a criminal matter. Mr. Royce nodded grimly. "Indeed, usually in a divorce we focus on the civil aspects, but if the court suspects criminal activity like tax evasion or fraud, it complicates things. The judge might refer it to the authorities or Maxwell might try to bury it. If you play this right, it could give you significant leverage in the divorce settlement. But it also means Julian will fight back even harder because he has more to lose." She bit her lip. "I don't want to blackmail him, I just want what's fair." "And you have every right to that," Mr. Royce said, removing the flash drive. "But be cautious. Maxwell Brown is known for intimidation tactics. He'll try to discredit Wendy, claim these documents were illegally obtained, or say they're fabricated." Catherine nodded, her determination renewed. "I'll be ready." Mr. Royce offered her a small smile of encouragement. "I see how hard you've been working. Just remember, the truth is on your side. That's a powerful weapon." They agreed on a plan. Catherine would store multiple copies of the files in safe locations, document Wendy's testimony carefully, and wait for the right moment to present the evidence in court, likely when Maxwell least expected it. Timing would be crucial. If they presented too early, Maxwell could scheme a counterattack or bury them in legal technicalities. If they waited too long, they might lose the advantage. When Catherine returned home that night, she locked her door, drew the blinds, and sat at her small dining table with her laptop. She began methodically labeling each folder, creating backups and writing summaries that connected each transaction to her marital assets. Her heart pounded with adrenaline, but underneath that, she felt a strange sense of calm. At least now, she wasn't stepping into the ring empty-handed. The next morning, Catherine received an unexpected text from Angela, her close friend. "I heard from a mutual friend that Julian is planning something big. Be careful." She called Angela immediately, her voice tense. "What do you mean, planning something big?" Angela sounded worried. "A friend of mine works at one of Julian's companies. She overheard him talking about accelerating the divorce proceedings, maybe pushing for an emergency hearing on some pretext. He might try to finalize everything before you have a chance to bring out the big guns." Catherine's mind raced. An emergency hearing could catch her off guard, especially if Maxwell petitioned the court claiming some urgent need regarding assets or business deals. If the court agreed, Catherine might have to scramble to gather her evidence sooner than anticipated. "How soon do you think they'll do this?" she asked. "I'm not sure, but if I were you, I'd be on high alert. They could file the motion any day now." Catherine thanked Angela and ended the call. A surge of anxiety coursed through her, but she quickly channeled it into action. She reached out to Mr. Royce, explaining the new development. They agreed to accelerate their own timeline. It was time to gather everything and be prepared to file a countermotion if needed. They wouldn't let Maxwell and Julian take them by surprise. Sure enough, 2 days later, Catherine received notice of a motion filed by Maxwell Brown, claiming that Julian needed the divorce settled promptly due to a significant business transaction that required clarity on his marital status and assets. The hearing was set for the following week. She read the notice multiple times, her fingers shaking slightly. The language was couched in legal formalities, but it was clear that Maxwell was trying to railroad her into a quick settlement. If the court ruled in favor of this motion, she'd have precious little time to present her new evidence. She needed to respond decisively. With Mr. Royce's help, she drafted a motion of her own, detailing why the divorce could not be rushed. The existence of undisclosed assets, the need for forensic accounting, and the likelihood that vital evidence was still being uncovered. She also hinted, though not explicitly, that there could be potential legal violations. It was risky. If Maxwell suspected they had a trump card, he might escalate his tactics even more. But there was no choice now. On the day of the hearing, Catherine arrived at the courthouse feeling like she was walking into a lion's den. She clutched her binder of evidence, carefully organized. She had emailed duplicates to Mr. Royce, stored digital copies in various cloud services, and kept the flash drive hidden at home. As she approached the courtroom, she spotted Maxwell and Julian engaged in hushed conversation. Maxwell's gaze flickered to Catherine as she passed, and a tight smile curved his lips. She took her seat at the respondents' table, the same place she'd sat weeks before. The atmosphere was more charged this time, a sense of tension so thick it was almost tangible. Judge Wright entered and everyone stood. Once the formalities were dispensed with, Maxwell rose. "Your Honor, we've filed a motion for expedited proceedings. My client's business dealings require that his marital status and financial obligations be clearly defined. Delaying this divorce any further would cause significant hardship to my client's ventures." Judge Wright eyed Maxwell, then turned to Catherine. "Ms. Fairchild, what is your response?" Catherine stood, trying to keep her voice steady. "Your Honor, I oppose the motion. Important evidence concerning undisclosed assets has recently come to light, and it requires thorough examination. Rushing to finalize the divorce would be unjust and would deny me a fair opportunity to present my case." Maxwell let out a theatrical sigh. "Your Honor, we've been more than patient with Ms. Fairchild's attempts to uncover these so-called hidden assets. She has produced nothing concrete to date, only accusations. Meanwhile, my client's businesses hang in the balance." Judge Wright leaned forward. "Ms. Fairchild, can you be more specific about this new evidence?" Catherine swallowed, glancing at Maxwell, who was watching her with hawk-like intensity. Yes, Your Honor, I can. I have documentation indicating that Mr. Fairchild transferred marital funds into accounts that were never disclosed, as well as emails directing employees to falsify financial statements. I believe this not only affects our marital assets, but also raises questions about legal compliance. A murmur rippled through the small group of observers. Julian stiffened visibly, and Maxwell's composure wavered just a fraction. Catherine noticed a flicker of panic in his eyes before he masked it. Judge Wright, for her part, looked intrigued. This is a serious allegation, Ms. Fairchild. Do you have these documents to submit today? Catherine hesitated. Should she present them now or wait for a more strategic moment? She decided to show enough to convince the judge not to expedite the divorce, but not everything. She removed a small portion of the evidence from her binder and handed it to the bailiff. These are some preliminary samples, Your Honor. I have more comprehensive files that I can provide upon a formal request for discovery. Judge Wright examined the papers, her expression growing more serious. She looked up at Maxwell. Mr. Brown, does your client have a response to these claims? Maxwell cleared his throat, recovering his posture. Your Honor, this is the first we're hearing of these specific documents. We question their authenticity and relevance. This appears to be a last-minute tactic by Ms. Fairchild to stall proceedings. Judge Wright raised an eyebrow. Ms. Fairchild, how did you come by these documents? Catherine answered truthfully but kept Wendy's identity confidential for the moment. An informant who used to work for my husband's company provided them. They were produced in the normal course of business, not obtained illegally. Maxwell bristled. Your Honor, we need the identity of this so-called informant to verify whether any confidentiality or non-disclosure agreements were breached. Judge Wright held up a hand. That is a matter for discovery. Right now, the question before me is whether or not to expedite these proceedings. Given the gravity of Ms. Fairchild's allegations and the preliminary documents she's provided, I am inclined to deny the motion for an accelerated timeline. We need to ensure a thorough investigation. Julian's expression soured and Maxwell's jaw tightened. Your Honor. But Judge Wright was resolute. We have a responsibility to conduct a fair process. I won't rush this case under these circumstances. The motion for expedited proceedings is denied. We'll proceed with the next scheduled hearing, at which point both sides are expected to present further evidence. Until then, Mr. Fairchild will continue to comply with the temporary spousal support order. Her gavel came down and a wave of relief washed over Catherine. She had secured a victory, albeit a preliminary one. Maxwell stared daggers at her and Julian looked livid. She suspected they would not take this setback lying down. As people began to file out, Maxwell walked over, his voice low and menacing. Impressive performance, Ms. Fairchild, but don't think for a moment that we won't find out where you got those documents and discredit them. You're playing with fire. Catherine met his gaze evenly. I'm only interested in the truth, Mr. Brown. If that's fire, then yes, I'm playing with it. His eyes flickered with cold rage before he turned on his heel and stalked away. Catherine gathered her belongings, her hands trembling slightly. She had won this round, but the war was far from over. Now that Maxwell and Julian knew about the hidden assets evidence, they would try every trick in the book to neutralize it. Still, as she walked out of the courthouse, a sense of empowerment filled her. She wasn't helpless anymore. She was learning how to stand her ground. And for the first time in a long while, she believed that she might not just survive this ordeal, but emerge stronger on the other side. She squared her shoulders against the wind, determined to see this battle through to the end, no matter what shocking revelations it might bring or how fiercely Maxwell Brown would fight back. Little did she know, the most startling truths were still waiting in the shadows, poised to shake the courtroom, the judge, and everyone involved in ways none of them could anticipate. Catherine left the courthouse that day with her heart still pounding from the confrontation. She clutched her binder of evidence, carefully guarded, and exhaled into the crisp afternoon air. She had fought to prevent Maxwell Brown from rushing the divorce, and she had won that round. Yet she understood that this was only the beginning of a more vicious legal war. Maxwell would regroup, Julian would strategize, and both men would come back even stronger now that they suspected the scale of what she had uncovered. Still, something in her stirred with renewed courage. She thought about Wendy Chu, the whistleblower who had risked so much to hand over that flash drive. The question that now shadowed Catherine's every step was whether Wendy would remain safe. Maxwell was known for intimidation tactics that could range from slander to threats of legal action against informants accused of breaching confidentiality. Catherine knew she needed to protect Wendy at all costs, both legally and personally. When Catherine arrived home, her small apartment felt as though it had been transformed into a war room. She laid her binder on the coffee table, then powered on her laptop. The shadows of evening fell through her windows, the glow of streetlights flickering across her sparse living space. She began drafting an email to Mr. Royce, explaining the events of the day in detail. She attached a few more pieces of documentation to ensure he could cross-reference them with relevant statutes. Once done, she sat back, tension coiling in her muscles. Anxiety threatened to overtake her, but she fought it off by recalling the expression on Maxwell's face when he realized she wasn't bluffing. He had looked taken aback for just an instant before collecting himself. Catherine knew that moment of shock might be the most valuable advantage she would gain in the near future. Maxwell thrived on control. Shaking his composure, even momentarily, was a crucial victory in itself. She spent the remainder of that night categorizing more data from the flash drive, labeling it systematically, and cross-referencing the suspicious transactions with the timeline of her marriage. The clock ticked past midnight, and still she continued, determined to leave no stone unturned. If Maxwell intended to fight dirty, she would be ready to counter every claim, every insinuation, every attempt to smear her name. At around 2 in the morning, she finally forced herself to rest. She fell into a fitful sleep, dreaming of standing in the courtroom holding a single sheet of paper that glowed like a beacon, while Maxwell and Julian snarled from the other side, clawing at the edges of the document. The judge sat high on her bench, silent as stone, while the entire room shook. When Catherine woke, she reminded herself that these nightmares were just a byproduct of her fear. Her real weapon was not some magical document, but a painstakingly gathered trove of evidence, and, as she'd come to realize, the grit she had discovered within herself. The next morning, she headed to her part-time office job, mind buzzing with thoughts about the upcoming legal showdown. Normally, she tried to keep her personal turmoil separate from work, but her concentration was shot. She typed with a kind of mechanical detachment, responding to emails on autopilot. Her boss, a kind but preoccupied man named Peter, noticed her distraction as he walked past her desk. He paused, cleared his throat, and gave her a sympathetic look. "You okay, Catherine?" She mustered a small smile. "Rough night, that's all." He nodded, not pressing further. Everyone in the office knew she was going through a divorce, though she kept the details private. Still, Catherine was thankful for the relative understanding she received from Peter and her co-workers, who granted her the time off she needed for court dates. During her lunch break, she stepped out to a nearby cafe, phone in hand. She needed to contact Wendy just to make sure everything was still all right. Wendy picked up on the second ring, her voice subdued. "Oh, hi, Catherine." "Hey," Catherine said, "I just wanted to check on you." Wendy sighed. "I'm okay, a little scared. I keep looking over my shoulder, expecting Maxwell or Julian to jump out from an alley." Catherine felt a stab of guilt. Wendy had taken a huge risk. "I'm so sorry you're in this position. If you feel unsafe or threatened in any way, you need to let me know. We'll figure out how to protect you, maybe even get a protective order if it comes to that." "I appreciate that," Wendy murmured. "No one's confronted me yet, but I can't shake the feeling they might. Julian always had a way of making me feel like I owed him something, even when I worked for him." Catherine's grip tightened on her phone. "If you have any sense that you're being followed or that your home is being watched, call me. Immediately." Wendy promised she would. They spoke for a few minutes more, mostly exchanging reassuring words that did little to quell their unease. By the time Catherine ended the call, she felt a fierce protectiveness toward Wendy. The young woman had given Catherine a fighting chance. In return, Catherine was determined not to let her shoulder all the risk. She returned to the office, devoting the rest of the afternoon to burying her anxiety in spreadsheets and routine tasks. Although it was a welcome reprieve, a constant undercurrent of tension still thrummed in the back of her mind. Days turned into a week, and Catherine's life fell into a pattern of careful preparation. She met with Mr. Royce every other evening at the local library or sometimes at a quiet coffee shop, discussing strategies to counter Maxwell's next moves. They suspected Maxwell might file motions questioning the legality of Wendy's whistleblowing or attempt to claim the documents had been tampered with. They also prepared for a wide range of personal attacks. Maxwell might try to paint Catherine as unstable, dishonest, or even manipulative. If he tries to assassinate your character, we respond calmly but decisively, Mr. Royce advised one evening, tapping a pen against a printout of the family court rules. We use facts. We don't fall into emotional outbursts. Catherine nodded. Easier said than done, but I'll do my best. Remember, he went on, Judge Wright seems conscientious. If you maintain composure, it'll contrast with whatever theatrics Maxwell tries to pull. Judges appreciate litigants who respect the court's time and process. Meanwhile, Catherine also made sure to keep her living space secure. She changed the locks on her apartment, placed a security bar against the front door, and parked her car in different spots on different days. She told a few trusted friends to check on her regularly. This all seemed paranoid, but given Maxwell's reputation, she refused to take chances. She also began to sense that Julian, for all his wealth and bravado, might be growing anxious. Once in a while, she caught glimpses of him, driving away from the parking lot near her workplace in his luxury SUV, or turning a corner on the street just as she emerged from a store. It could have been her imagination, but something in his eyes the one time they briefly locked gazes looked almost remorseful or perhaps threatened. She couldn't parse the emotion clearly. One late afternoon, as she left the grocery store with a small bag of basics, she spotted Julian standing by his car looking at her. He said nothing. Catherine hesitated, then walked on. He made no move to approach her, simply watched. That silent tension hovered in the air until she disappeared down a side street. It reminded her in a stark and unsettling way of just how entangled their lives had once been, and how that entanglement now hung by a bitter thread of legalities and secrets. The day of the next court hearing arrived. This time, it was not an emergency session but a scheduled proceeding to address the prenuptial agreement and the evidence Catherine had submitted regarding undisclosed assets. She woke up early, nerves jangling. To calm herself, she practiced the breathing exercises she'd learned in yoga class, mentally rehearsing how she would present her points. She arrived at the courthouse a half-hour early, stepping into the familiar marble lobby where attorneys, clerks, and litigants milled about. Taking a seat on one of the benches, she spotted Maxwell Brown and Julian almost immediately. Maxwell looked impeccably groomed in a dark charcoal suit, and Julian wore a navy ensemble with a crisp white shirt. Their expressions were grim, lacking the self-assured complacency she had seen at earlier hearings. She didn't approach them, there was no reason to. Instead, she waited for the clerk to call her case. When it came time, she entered the courtroom and found her usual seat at the respondent's table. She organized her files, making sure everything was within easy reach. A hush fell as Judge Eleanora Wright entered, her robe rustling. After a few preliminary matters, the court arrived at Fairchild versus Fairchild. Judge Wright scanned the documents in front of her, then addressed both parties. We're here to discuss the validity of the prenuptial agreement and Ms. Fairchild's allegations regarding hidden assets. Mr. Brown, is your client prepared to respond? Maxwell stood, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of tension. Yes, Your Honor, we maintain that the prenuptial agreement is valid and enforceable. My client provided Ms. Fairchild with ample opportunity for legal counsel before she signed it, and it was signed without duress. Judge Wright nodded. Ms. Fairchild, you challenge the agreement's validity on grounds of inadequate representation and possibly unconscionable terms. Is that correct? Catherine rose, smoothing her skirt nervously. Yes, Your Honor, I had no legal counsel and the terms heavily favored my husband. It was presented to me just days before our wedding. I signed under emotional pressure, not fully understanding the implications. Moreover, the existence of undisclosed assets further calls the agreement into question, as it suggests my husband did not fully disclose his financial situation before or during the marriage. Maxwell interjected, Your Honor, the prenuptial agreement pertains to the assets Julian held at the time. Any new business ventures he pursued subsequently are beyond its scope. Catherine met Maxwell's gaze. But we're talking about marital funds. If those funds were commingled or used to acquire assets that were never disclosed, the prenuptial agreement doesn't shield those assets from being considered joint property. Judge Wright looked from Maxwell to Catherine. Let's address one issue at a time. First, the prenuptial agreement's enforceability. Ms. Fairchild, do you have any witnesses or evidence to support your claims of duress or inadequate representation? Catherine took a steadying breath. I do not have a direct witness to the signing, but I have correspondence, text messages and emails from that period where I expressed confusion and reluctance. It shows how rushed everything was. As for the agreement's fairness, if the court looks at the asset distribution, it's egregiously one-sided. Judge Wright flipped through the copies Catherine had submitted. I'll review these carefully. Maxwell, anticipating a shift, angled his body toward the judge. Your Honor, there is no mention in these texts of Ms. Fairchild requesting more time to consult an attorney. She simply expressed mild concern and moved forward with the signing. The burden to seek legal counsel was on her. Catherine bit the inside of her cheek, choosing her next words cautiously. I was naive, perhaps, but I was also misled to believe it was a mere formality. Julian had the resources and I did not. He insisted we had no time to postpone the wedding. If I refused to sign, the wedding would be cancelled. That's a form of pressure, if not outright duress. Judge Wright raised an eyebrow, then made a note. I'll take this under advisement. Now, regarding the hidden assets, Ms. Fairchild, have you submitted more comprehensive documentation? Catherine nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I've submitted additional transaction records that I believe show a pattern of money being diverted from our joint account to offshore accounts. I can provide more upon formal request. Judge Wright looked at Maxwell again. Mr. Brown, do you have any preliminary response to these records? Maxwell's lips thinned. Your Honor, we contend that these documents are either incomplete or taken out of context. Some appear to have been obtained from a company insider, potentially violating confidentiality agreements and privacy laws. We also believe there could be forgery involved. A low murmur of surprise spread among the few observers in the gallery. Catherine's eyes flared. Forgery? That's a serious accusation, Mr. Brown. Are you suggesting I fabricated emails and financial statements? Maxwell shot her a cold glance. We are merely raising the possibility that these documents may not be authentic, or that they might be fragments of a larger financial picture that Ms. Fairchild doesn't fully grasp. Judge Wright tapped her pen on the bench. All right, let's not jump to conclusions. Given the complexity, I'm going to order a brief continuance so that both parties can engage in discovery. We may also consider appointing a forensic accountant to examine the authenticity and relevance of these financial records. Maxwell opened his mouth to object, but Judge Wright held up her hand. Mr. Brown, I suspect your client has nothing to hide, so this should not be a problem. The mild rebuke made Maxwell close his mouth, though his glare spoke volumes. Catherine suppressed a small surge of satisfaction. This was another incremental win. The judge recognized that the documents warranted a thorough look and that Maxwell's blanket dismissal wouldn't cut it. As for the prenuptial agreement, Judge Wright continued, I will reserve judgment until after I've seen the results of discovery. If it turns out there were significant undisclosed assets, or if Ms. Fairchild can prove undue pressure, the agreement may be invalidated in whole or in part. Court is adjourned until the next hearing, at which time we will address the forensic accountant's report. With a swift gavel strike, the hearing ended. Catherine gathered her files, feeling Maxwell's gaze on her. She half expected him to swoop over with more threats, but he simply left with Julian, both men departing in tense silence. Outside, the day's heat wrapped around her as she walked down the courthouse steps. She breathed in, letting the swirl of relief and lingering anxiety settle. Another delay, another chance to strengthen her position. The weight of the next confrontation loomed, but for the moment she felt a small sense of pride. She was holding her own. In the days that followed, Catherine arranged for a sit-down meeting with Wendy and Mr. Royce in a safe, private location, a small law clinic conference room that Mr. Royce had access to from his days of community service. The clinic was rarely staffed after hours, so they could talk uninterrupted. Wendy arrived carrying a slim briefcase, her face etched with stress. "Thank you both for meeting me," Wendy said, voice quivering. "I keep expecting Maxwell or one of Julian's people to show up at my door with a lawsuit or a restraining order." Mr. Royce offered a reassuring nod. "That may happen, but we'll be prepared. You're doing the right thing by clarifying the nature of the documents." They spent the next 2 hours combing through the data on Wendy's laptop, verifying metadata on the files, cross-referencing dates. Wendy explained how each transaction had originated, how the entries in the accounting software had been manipulated, and how she'd been instructed to record certain sums as overseas investments for which no returns were ever officially reported. "It's a classic shell game," Wendy said quietly. "Julian used multiple shell corporations, often in the names of business partners or relatives. The money would bounce around, making it hard to trace." Catherine leaned forward, scanning the screen. "But we have the logs, we can follow the trail." Wendy nodded. "Yes, but Maxwell will claim we violated confidentiality or that the logs are doctored. He might also argue that these transactions are legitimate business deals. The question is whether the court's forensic accountant will find them suspicious enough to warrant further investigation." Mr. Royce stroked his chin. "At the very least, these logs show an intent to hide or obscure. That's relevant in a divorce, especially if Catherine can show that the funds originated in a joint account." Catherine felt a mix of anger and sadness. She remembered times when she and Julian had talked about starting a family, about building a future together, memories now soured by the realization that he had likely been siphoning money away even then. "Julian always insisted we keep a single joint checking account for household expenses," she murmured. "I assumed it was normal, but it must have made it easier for him to move things around." Mr. Royce placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's not your fault. Many people trust their spouses to handle finances. That trust is precisely what's exploited in cases like these." Wendy exhaled shakily. "I'll do my best to explain all this if I have to testify, but it's going to get ugly, isn't it?" Catherine nodded, giving Wendy a grateful look. "It might. Maxwell will try to discredit you, but we'll stand together, we'll show the truth." Before they parted ways, they agreed on a strategy. They would request that Wendy's identity remain confidential as long as possible, revealing it only when necessary to authenticate the documents in court. Mr. Royce also mentioned the possibility of requesting a protective order if threats arose. Wendy looked marginally reassured but still tense. A few days later, a thick envelope arrived at Catherine's apartment. It bore Maxwell Brown's law firm's insignia. Inside were formal requests for production of documents and interrogatories, long lists of questions Catherine was required to answer under oath. He wanted every detail of how she obtained the financial records, the identity of her source, and the exact chain of custody. There was also a note that deposed Wendy as a potential witness, demanding her presence at a deposition. Catherine's stomach clenched. This was the next logical step, Maxwell turning the screws through official channels. She forwarded everything to Mr. Royce, who counseled her to be truthful but cautious. If Wendy was deposed, they would need to prepare her thoroughly so Maxwell's intimidation wouldn't rattle her. Catherine was well aware depositions could be grueling, especially with a lawyer like Maxwell. He'd pick at every word, twist every admission, threaten perjury if he caught the slightest inconsistency. She found herself reading and rereading the list of questions, imagining how each might be used against her. But she also knew they had an ace in the hole, the sheer volume and authenticity of Wendy's records. If Maxwell tried to claim forgery, the forensic accountant, and hopefully the judge would see through that smokescreen. The day of Wendy's deposition arrived, set in one of the small conference rooms at Maxwell's law firm. Catherine, though not an attorney, was allowed to attend as Wendy's support since she was the primary party in the case. Mr. Royce, despite being retired, had agreed to stand by as Wendy's unofficial counsel. He couldn't practice formally in the matter, but he could be present as an advisor and moral support. It was a gray area, but Maxwell's office hadn't objected. Wendy looked pale as they sat outside the conference room, waiting for the call to enter. Catherine gently squeezed her hand. "Just tell the truth, calmly and clearly. Don't volunteer extra information. Answer exactly what you're asked." Wendy nodded, swallowing hard. At last, an assistant ushered them in. The room had neutral gray walls, harsh fluorescent lighting, and a long, polished table. Maxwell sat at the head, flanked by a younger associate who typed furiously on a laptop. A court reporter was already setting up her equipment to transcribe the deposition. Julian was absent, presumably by design or because Maxwell believed his presence might be too inflammatory. Wendy took a seat, Catherine to her left, Mr. Royce to her right. They exchanged quick looks of solidarity. Maxwell began with the usual formalities. The court reporter asked Wendy to swear to tell the truth. Then he launched into his questions, starting with background, her education, her employment history, how she came to work for Julian. Wendy answered in a trembling voice at first, but she gradually steadied. She explained that she had started as a bookkeeper at a small offshoot of Julian's business empire, then later transferred to the main accounting department when her superiors recognized her diligence. Maxwell nodded as he listened, tapping his pen. "So you became privy to confidential financial information, correct?" "Yes," Wendy answered. "I had to enter data, reconcile statements, and produce internal financial reports." Maxwell flipped a page on his legal pad. "At what point did you decide to copy these documents onto your personal storage device, if that is indeed how you obtained them?" Wendy shot a quick, nervous glance at Catherine, then answered, "I kept digital copies as backups whenever I was asked to make questionable entries. It made me uncomfortable, so I wanted a record. Eventually, I decided to resign. Then I still had those files." Maxwell's tone hardened. "And you knew that taking these files violated the confidentiality agreements you signed upon employment, correct? You understood that, from a legal standpoint, your actions could be considered theft of proprietary information." Wendy's lip trembled. Yes, I knew it might be a violation, but I believed it was necessary to protect myself in case anything illegal came to light, and it has." Maxwell let out a soft, dismissive laugh. "So you broke the law because you felt uneasy, and now you're using these stolen documents to assist Ms. Fairchild in her divorce. How altruistic of you." Mr. Royce leaned forward, object to characterization. The witness can answer without the sarcasm. Wendy's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. "I'm not using them to assist Ms. Fairchild in anything malicious. I'm providing evidence of wrongdoing. You can call it theft if you want, but the court can decide the legality." Maxwell maintained a smirk. "Fine, let's address the substance of these so-called documents. Can you confirm that you manipulated them, possibly to create the impression of wrongdoing where none existed?" Wendy's eyes flashed. "No, I did not manipulate anything. I reported figures as Julian instructed, then saved the raw data in a separate folder. The numbers show what actually transpired, not the doctored versions they wanted the official records to reflect." Maxwell flipped through a stack of papers. "I see multiple spreadsheets here. They refer to accounts in the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, and Singapore. Are you aware that my client frequently invests internationally, which is entirely legal? How can you assert that these were hidden assets?" Wendy, seeming to gain confidence, pointed to the top sheet. Because these accounts don't appear in the general ledger or the annual reports. That's not typical for legitimate investments. Also, Mr. Fairchild specifically said to mark them as miscellaneous expenses in the final statements, which is not how one would categorize an international investment of millions of dollars. Maxwell's lips pressed together. He pounced on another line of questioning. Could it be that your misunderstanding of high-level financial decisions led you to false conclusions? She shook her head. I'm not misunderstanding. I have a degree in accounting and I've worked in finance for years. The instructions were deliberately designed to mask large sums. If you look at the email instructions, she gestured to a file. Mr. Fairchild specifically said not to mention these transactions to auditors. An uneasy silence settled. Maxwell shot a quick glance at his associate, then cleared his throat. We'll be sure to have our own forensic expert review these documents. I'm sure we'll find a reasonable explanation. He then pivoted back to Wendy's relationship with Catherine. How well do you know Ms. Fairchild? Is there any chance you're collaborating to fabricate evidence for a personal vendetta against my client? Catherine bristled, but Mr. Royce placed a calming hand on her arm. Wendy spoke, her voice trembling slightly with anger. I barely knew Catherine before this. I reached out because I felt guilty and believed she deserved the truth. There's no vendetta. Julian was my boss and I saw things I couldn't ignore. Maxwell continued with pointed, often repetitive questions, trying to trip Wendy up or make her contradict herself. He brought up small inconsistencies, like the exact date she copied certain files or the number of times she'd spoken to Catherine before handing them over. Wendy faltered on a few details, but overall remained consistent. She grew increasingly exasperated, as did Mr. Royce. Finally, after nearly 3 hours, Maxwell concluded with a sneer. Well, Ms. Chu, you've certainly presented your perspective. Let's hope, for your sake, that it holds up under legal scrutiny. Wendy gave a tired nod, and Catherine could almost see the relief flood her posture once Maxwell said they were done. The court reporter began packing up. Catherine helped Wendy gather her belongings, and they stood. Maxwell offered a curt nod, then strode out without further pleasantries. His associate followed silently. Mr. Royce turned to Wendy. You did fine. Maxwell tried to rattle you, but you stayed on message. Wendy let out a shaky sigh. It was exhausting, though. I feel like I need a nap for a week. Catherine gave her a supportive smile. Thank you so much. This was a huge step. Wendy smiled weakly. I just hope it's enough. In the days after the deposition, Catherine lived with a heightened sense of urgency. She had done well in staving off Maxwell's maneuvers so far, but she sensed an oncoming storm. She suspected Maxwell might attempt a private settlement to shut her up quickly, perhaps offering a larger payout if she dropped the allegations. Alternatively, he might tighten the screws in a more aggressive way, smear campaigns, character attacks, or dragging out the legal process until she was financially and emotionally drained. Nothing could have prepared her, however, for the phone call she received one evening. She had just finished a quick dinner, sitting at her small dining table still piled with legal papers when her phone buzzed. The caller ID flashed unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Catherine Fairchild, she said cautiously. A man's voice came through, rough and low. I have information you need about Julian, but I can't speak on record. Her heartbeat quickened. Who is this? You don't know me, but let's say I used to work in a similar capacity as your friend Wendy. I know about the shell corporations, the offshore accounts, but that's not why I'm calling. Julian has something else up his sleeve. He's meeting with certain city officials. He's trying to sweeten deals so they turn a blind eye to your case. I can't say more, but watch out for strange rulings. Catherine's spine tingled. How do I know this is real? This could be a trick. You'll just have to trust me, or don't. But you should be prepared for the possibility that this trial might be influenced. Maxwell has connections, so does Julian. I'll text you something, an address. There's a file in a safe deposit box there under the name Morgan Palmer. The key is taped under the middle drawer of the desk in Julian's old office. If you can get it, you'll have proof of their attempts at bribery. Just be careful." Before Catherine could respond, the line went dead. She stared at her phone, pulse hammering. Could this be genuine or a setup? She considered the risk, going to Julian's old office to search for a key. It sounded like a trap, but if it was real, it could blow the case wide open and possibly lead to criminal charges far beyond financial fraud. Bribing city officials, that was serious, potentially on a different level altogether. She called Mr. Royce, recounting every word of the mysterious conversation. He was understandably skeptical. "This might be Maxwell's attempt to entrap you in illegal entry or theft," he warned. "Don't walk into a trap." "Julian's old office is in the building where we both used to work," Catherine said, chewing her lip. "But it's always locked and I'm no longer an employee. I have no legitimate reason to go in." Mr. Royce sighed. "Then don't. Let's think this through. If there's a key, maybe we can get a subpoena or a court order to search. Doing it on your own is risky." Catherine saw his point, but a subpoena would tip off Maxwell and Julian. They'd have time to hide or destroy whatever was in that safe deposit box if it even existed. She mulled over the options, torn between caution and the lure of a game-changing piece of evidence. For now, she decided to wait and see if the caller would follow up. No sense rushing into a potentially dangerous scenario without more information. She ended the call with Mr. Royce, promising to keep him updated. Still, the seeds of intrigue had been planted, and Catherine couldn't deny the flicker of excitement at the possibility of exposing Julian's corruption in an even more dramatic way. A few days later, Catherine received a court summons for a crucial hearing. Judge Wright had granted the request for a forensic accountant who had already started examining the documents from both sides. The hearing was set to address initial findings and to decide if a full forensic audit of Julian's finances was warranted. On the morning of the hearing, Catherine dressed in her best professional attire, a black suit jacket and matching skirt, determined to appear poised. She arrived at the courthouse to see Maxwell waiting outside the courtroom with Julian. They seemed deep in conversation, and Julian's face was red with anger, gesturing in frustration. When Catherine approached, they stopped talking abruptly. Catherine ignored them, stepping inside. She took her usual seat and tried to compose herself. Judge Wright soon entered, calling the session to order. "Today we'll hear from the forensic accountant, Ms. Patricia Morgan," the judge announced. A woman in her late 50s with neatly pinned gray hair and a crisp navy blazer approached the witness stand. After being sworn in, she began her testimony. "I've conducted a preliminary review of the financial records provided by both Ms. Fairchild and Mr. Fairchild," Ms. Morgan said. "Based on what I've seen so far, there are multiple transactions that raise questions about whether Mr. Fairchild fully disclosed all relevant assets." Maxwell stood. "Ms. Morgan, are you suggesting my client's businesses, which span multiple international markets, are somehow improper simply because their transactions are complex?" Ms. Morgan remained calm. "Complexity isn't inherently improper. However, certain large transfers from the marital account to offshore entities were not listed in Mr. Fairchild's initial disclosures. I'm also concerned about the classification of certain investments as expenses. This is irregular and merits deeper investigation." Judge Wright turned her discerning gaze toward Maxwell. "Mr. Brown, why were these accounts not disclosed initially?" Maxwell maintained a composed facade. "Your Honor, Mr. Fairchild has multiple corporate ventures. The line between personal and business assets can sometimes blur. We are in the process of clarifying which accounts are truly personal and which belong to separate legal entities. There was no intent to mislead." Ms. Morgan continued, "I'm recommending a full forensic audit to definitively determine whether these assets fall within the marital estate. The preliminary findings indicate the possibility of concealed income streams." Maxwell interjected again. "Your Honor, a full forensic audit is an extreme step. It would be costly, time-consuming, and burdensome. We believe Ms. Fairchild should bear the cost, given that she's the one alleging wrongdoing. Judge Wright pursed her lips. We'll address who pays at a later time. For now, I'm inclined to order the audit, given the seriousness of the allegations. This court wants certainty about the financial picture before making any final rulings on asset division or spousal support. Catherine felt a wave of relief. This was a major development. A full forensic audit could lay bare all of Julian's hidden schemes. She glanced over at Maxwell and Julian, both stony-faced. Judge Wright adjourned the hearing after confirming the timeline for the audit. As Catherine gathered her papers, Maxwell approached, leaning in with a quiet but pointed remark. "You're just drawing this out, Ms. Fairchild. Eventually, you'll run out of money or patience. My client is ready to settle if you drop the allegations of fraud." Catherine fixed him with a level stare. "You're offering hush money, is that it? No, I'm seeing this through." Maxwell's jaw tightened. "Then you'll regret it." Without another word, he strode off, Julian following close behind. Catherine watched them go, her heart pounding. The intimidation was ramping up. She just hoped she was strong enough to finish what she had started. Over the next week, the forensic accounting team requested reams of documentation from Julian's companies. Maxwell tried to stonewall, claiming attorney-client privilege or corporate confidentiality for much of the data. However, Judge Wright issued a pointed warning that noncompliance would not be tolerated. In the midst of this tense standoff, Catherine received an email from her mysterious caller, this time from an encrypted address with no identifiable name. It reiterated the earlier message, that Julian was attempting to use political connections to sway the case and that the safe deposit box might contain the proof. The email also mentioned a specific city official rumored to be in Julian's pocket, referencing a code name, Project Arbor. Catherine forwarded the email to Mr. Royce. They agreed that if this was genuine evidence of public corruption, the ramifications extended beyond the divorce. It could lead to a criminal investigation involving government officials, but how to verify it without risking a trap? In a moment of boldness, Catherine decided to pay a visit to the building that housed Julian's old office. She told herself she would not break in or do anything illegal. She just needed to see if there was any sign of that key. If it was obvious that she couldn't retrieve it without committing trespass, she'd back off. She arrived on a Sunday when the building was mostly empty. The lobby security guard recognized her from years ago. She and Julian had occasionally arrived together for events, and he gave her a friendly wave. With an air of casual confidence, she took the elevator to the 15th floor. The corridors were quiet, the fluorescent lights dimmed to weekend mode. She found the door to Julian's old office, Suite 1512, and tested the handle, locked of course. Through the frosted glass panel, she could see a dark reception area. Her heart pounded. If she used a credit card or something to slip the lock, that would be illegal. Instead, she simply tried a few desk drawers in the hallway. Nothing. She was about to leave when she realized the office next door, Suite 1514, was being renovated and stood wide open. She peeked inside. The dividing wall between 1514 and 1512 had been partially removed for construction. A chunk of drywall was missing, leaving open beams and a partial view into what had once been Julian's office. If the workers had left an opening large enough to slip through. Adrenaline surged. This wasn't precisely breaking in, she rationalized. The door to 1514 was open, presumably for contractors. The dividing wall was half demolished. She was merely investigating a vacant space. The moment she told herself that, she winced inwardly. She was definitely teetering on the edge of legality, but some part of her couldn't walk away. She stepped into 1514, scanning the half-finished walls, strewn tools, and battered ladders. A thick layer of dust coated the floor. Sure enough, there was an opening about 3 feet wide in the shared wall, just big enough to squeeze through. On the other side was a dimly lit corner of Julian's old office. Her heart hammered. This was insane, but if that key was just taped under a drawer, maybe she could see it without disturbing anything. Gathering her courage, Catherine slipped through the opening. She landed in a small corner near a row of file cabinets. The office had been mostly cleared out. A few stray pieces of furniture remained: a desk, a rolling chair, and a small table. She flicked on the flashlight app on her phone, careful to keep it aimed low to avoid attracting attention from outside. Dust motes swirled in the beam of light. The desk looked old, with chipped varnish. She crouched beside it, sliding her hand under the middle drawer. Her fingers brushed smooth wood, then something taped to it. Her heart leapt. She peeled back the tape, retrieving a small, tarnished key. She held it up in the light. This was real, she'd found it. Before she could even process her next move, a noise from the corridor froze her in place. Footsteps. Were they approaching the door of 1512? She killed the phone's flashlight and pressed herself against the wall, breathing shallowly. A moment later, the footsteps receded. She let out a shaky exhale. She stuffed the key into her pocket. Now came the hard part, getting out unseen. She carefully stepped back through the gap into 1514, then hurried out into the hallway, trying to appear as casual as possible. She closed the door behind her and made her way back to the elevator, heart pounding so loudly she thought the security guard downstairs might hear it. When she reached the lobby, she forced a smile for the guard. He nodded politely, and she pushed out into the cool late afternoon air, nerves frayed. She walked 2 blocks before allowing herself to examine the key. It looked old-fashioned, with a tiny engraved number that could be a safe deposit box reference. Now she had to decide what to do with it. She texted Mr. Royce, "I have the key. Long story, we need to talk." That evening, Catherine and Mr. Royce met again in the same law clinic conference room. She recounted her harrowing experience, omitting no details. Mr. Royce looked both alarmed and impressed. "You were lucky you didn't get caught," he remarked gravely. "This was a huge risk." She nodded, cheeks flushing with adrenaline. "I know, but if this leads to proof of bribery, it's worth it." He examined the key under the fluorescent light. "The number on here suggests it belongs to a local bank's safe deposit system. We could try to gain access, but unless your name is on the box's records, the bank won't let you open it. We could approach the court to request a search order, but that tips our hand." Catherine let out a frustrated sigh. "So we still need an official route, or find a way to confirm what's in there without going through normal channels." Mr. Royce tapped the table. "We could file a motion to preserve evidence. Argue that we have reason to believe Mr. Fairchild is storing critical documents in a safe deposit box. But Maxwell might just claim the box doesn't exist or belongs to someone else." She placed her head in her hands. "Every time we find a lead, it's like we need to jump through 10 more hoops. Meanwhile, Julian and Maxwell try to stonewall us at every turn." Mr. Royce gave her a gentle smile. "The system is slow, but it can be made to work. Another option, we confront Julian's side informally, mention the box number, and see how they react. If they panic or threaten us, that might be evidence in itself." Catherine shook her head. "That feels like a bluff game, and I doubt Maxwell will blink first." They left the key in a secure lockbox at the clinic for now, deciding to wait for the forensic audit's next phase. If Ms. Morgan uncovered more suspicious finances, they'd have stronger grounds to petition the court for access to the safe deposit box. Catherine couldn't help but feel a mixture of anticipation and dread at what might lie inside. A few days later, Catherine was at her apartment, reviewing the latest letters from Maxwell's firm, more demands for documents, depositions, and intimidation-laced legal jargon, when her phone rang. It was Angela, her close friend. "Catherine," Angela said, voice trembling, "I just heard something from a mutual acquaintance. Julian is fuming about some missing key. Apparently, he's been searching his old office. He knows it's gone and thinks you took it." Catherine's blood ran cold. She swallowed. "How does he know?" "Apparently, he was ranting at some of his staff members, accusing them of incompetence for letting the office be open. He said something about, 'If Catherine thinks she can outsmart me, she's wrong.' Sounded dangerous." Catherine closed her eyes. She recalled that moment in the hallway, the footsteps. Could it have been Julian or one of his people? Had they come just minutes too late? Thanks for letting me know. I'm okay, but I'll be extra careful. Angela hesitated. He sounded unhinged. Please watch your back if you need a place to stay. No, Catherine said, I'll be all right, but I appreciate it. She hung up, heart hammering. She felt a swirl of fear and resolve. Julian had discovered her infiltration. He was furious. That only validated the key's importance. Whatever was in that deposit box, it was crucial enough for him to come unglued. Sure enough, the following day brought a new twist. Catherine received a notice from Maxwell's firm indicating that Julian sought a temporary restraining order against her, claiming she had trespassed and stolen property from his old office. The motion alleged that Catherine posed a threat to his business interests. Reading the language made her stomach churn. She showed the notice to Mr. Royce, who shook his head in disbelief. This is pure retaliation. They're trying to paint you as the aggressor to hamper your credibility with the court. Catherine bit her lip. Can we fight it? We absolutely can, but they'll try to drag you through the mud saying you broke into private property. Did you, by any chance, have permission to be on that floor? She grimaced. Not exactly, but the door to 1514 was open and the office I went into was vacant. I didn't damage anything or force entry. Mr. Royce sighed. It might still be considered trespassing. However, Julian would have to prove you intended to commit a crime. Our best move is to argue that you were there for a legitimate reason, maybe to pick up personal items. Catherine raised an eyebrow, a bit of a stretch. Sometimes the law is about plausible narratives, he replied. Either way, this is a hearing we have to handle carefully. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, Catherine scrambled to gather any evidence that she'd had some reason to be in that building. Her older time sheets from years ago, emails with staff referencing old personal belongings in the office, anything to create a rationale. She felt uneasy about bending the truth, but Maxwell was forcing her hand. On the day of the hearing, she stepped into the family court again, her nerves as taut as piano wires. This was a separate judge, not Judge Wright, because it was a civil protection order matter. Judge Poole presided, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and sharp eyes. Maxwell argued that Catherine had illegally entered Julian's private office to pilfer confidential documents, citing the presence of a security camera that caught her in the hallway. The footage, he said, showed her loitering near the door. Catherine's pulse quickened. She hadn't known about a camera. Maxwell produced still images, though none showed her actually entering the office. When it was Catherine's turn, she denied any wrongdoing, stating she went to the building to see if there were personal items left behind from when she worked alongside Julian, items that might be relevant to the ongoing divorce. The door to that suite had been open due to renovations. She insisted she didn't force entry or steal anything. The judge peered down at the photos. Mr. Brown, do you have evidence she actually entered Mr. Fairchild's office? Maxwell's lips curved. We have reason to believe a key was taken from a desk drawer. My client discovered it missing shortly after Ms. Fairchild was caught on camera. Catherine's heart thudded. She tried to keep her composure. That's speculation. There's no proof I took anything. The judge furrowed his brow. Mr. Brown, do you have any direct proof, such as footage of Ms. Fairchild exiting with the item? Maxwell's smile was thin. Not yet, Your Honor, but the timing is highly suggestive. Judge Poole tapped his pen. I'm not entirely convinced. A civil harassment restraining order typically requires evidence of ongoing harassment or threats. Ms. Fairchild is the one divorcing Mr. Fairchild, correct? Why would she harass him in his old office? It seems more like a property dispute. Maxwell attempted to spin it further, alleging Catherine was obsessed with digging up dirt to sabotage Julian's businesses. But the judge remained skeptical. eventually ruling that while Catherine should refrain from entering Julian's properties without permission, there was insufficient evidence to justify a restraining order. Catherine exhaled a quiet sigh of relief. She had narrowly dodged that bullet. But as she left the courtroom, Maxwell caught up with her in the hallway. "This isn't over," he snarled. "You have something that belongs to Mr. Fairchild, and we will prove it." Catherine stood firm. "I have nothing that doesn't already belong to me or to our marital estate." Maxwell's jaw clenched and he stalked away. She watched him go, a swirl of fear and defiance in her stomach. This war was escalating and the cost was mounting on both sides. Yet the full forensic audit was still pending, and that remained her greatest hope to unravel Julian's financial deceptions. 2 weeks later, Ms. Morgan, the court-appointed forensic accountant, submitted an interim report. It was sealed, accessible only to the judge and the attorneys, but rumor reached Catherine that the report was damning. Apparently, Ms. Morgan had found significant irregularities that required a deeper dive. The judge scheduled yet another hearing at which Ms. Morgan would testify. This time, it promised to be a pivotal moment. If Ms. Morgan testified that Julian had systematically hidden assets, it could shift the entire balance of the case in Catherine's favor. The hearing took place on a bright Monday morning. The courtroom was more crowded than usual as word of the high-stakes divorce had begun to circulate. A few local reporters lingered, sniffing for a sensational story. Julian arrived with Maxwell, both wearing grim expressions. Catherine, for her part, felt a combination of trepidation and resolve. Wendy also came to observe, sitting quietly in the back row, her shoulders tense. Judge Wright began the session with a calm announcement. "We will hear from Ms. Patricia Morgan on the status of the forensic audit. Ms. Morgan, please step forward." Ms. Morgan took the stand, her posture upright, a stack of documents in front of her. "Good morning, Your Honor. Over the past few weeks, I've reviewed extensive financial records belonging to Mr. Fairchild's various enterprises, as well as documents provided by Ms. Fairchild. The preliminary findings suggest that Mr. Fairchild transferred significant sums from what appear to be marital funds into offshore accounts. Some accounts are registered to shell corporations, lacking transparency regarding ownership or purpose." A ripple of tension moved through the courtroom. Catherine caught Julian's eyes flicking nervously. Ms. Morgan continued, "These transactions total in the millions of dollars. Moreover, the classification of these transfers as operational expenses or overseas fees appears inconsistent with legitimate business accounting practices." Maxwell rose, adopting an air of polite skepticism. "Ms. Morgan, do you have conclusive proof these are marital funds? Could they not be personal or business earnings that never entered the marital estate?" Ms. Morgan remained composed. "Bank statements indicate that the originating account was jointly held by Mr. and Ms. Fairchild. I have copies of wiring instructions bearing both their names. The funds were then routed through intermediate accounts before landing in the final offshore destinations." Catherine's heart soared. This was exactly the kind of clarity she needed. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "Mr. Brown," Judge Wright said, "this is a serious matter. Why did Mr. Fairchild not disclose these accounts in his financial affidavit?" Maxwell adjusted his tie, maintaining a veneer of calm. "Your Honor, as we've stated, Mr. Fairchild's financial structure is complex. He was not aware that some funds might be classified as marital property if they were initially deposited into joint accounts. This was an oversight, not an act of deception." Judge Wright's expression remained stony. "We'll let the final audit speak to that. Ms. Morgan, what do you recommend?" Ms. Morgan gave a firm nod. "I recommend continuing a full forensic audit with subpoena power extended to the offshore institutions if possible. It's my professional opinion that the sums in question belong, at least in part, to the marital estate." A smattering of hushed conversation broke out among the observers. Catherine saw a reporter scribbling furiously in a notebook. Judge Wright tapped her gavel lightly for order. "Very well," said the judge. "I will expand Ms. Morgan's authority to subpoena offshore records. Mr. Fairchild is ordered to comply fully. Failure to do so will result in sanctions." Maxwell tried to protest, but Judge Wright held firm. "I won't tolerate any further evasion, Mr. Brown. The point of a forensic audit is to bring clarity, not more confusion." Catherine felt a surge of vindication. Julian's confident mask had slipped, replaced by grim acceptance. This was a huge step toward exposing the hidden funds. If the offshore subpoenas went through, the entire house of cards might collapse. Outside the courtroom, a small knot of reporters gathered around Catherine, peppering her with questions about the alleged offshore accounts. She had never faced media scrutiny before, and it rattled her. She offered only a brief statement. "I trust the legal process to uncover the truth. I have no further comment." Then she hurried away, seeking privacy. But the headlines the next day told the story. High-profile businessman accused of hiding marital assets offshore, with Julian's photo plastered beside a subheadline about a ruthless divorce battle. Catherine felt a conflicted swirl of triumph and anxiety. Publicity could pressure Julian, but it could also make him desperate. And Maxwell was a master of manipulation. A day later, Catherine's phone buzzed. It was an unknown local number. She answered hesitantly. "Ms. Fairchild," a crisp male voice said. "My name is Detective Samuel Haynes from the Financial Crimes Unit. I read about your case in the news. We're interested in speaking with you regarding some of the allegations." Her breath caught. Allegations of what exactly? Possible money laundering, tax evasion, and corporate fraud. "We see you've alleged that Mr. Fairchild used offshore accounts to hide assets. We've had tips about him before, but nothing concrete. Now it looks like we might have something worth investigating." Catherine's throat felt dry. "I'm in the middle of a divorce proceeding. All the evidence is with the court-appointed forensic accountant." The detective's tone was respectful. "Understood. We don't want to disrupt your case, but if any criminal activity is confirmed, it goes beyond a family court matter. Would you be willing to meet with us to discuss what you know?" Catherine paused. This was uncharted territory. She realized she needed Mr. Royce's guidance. "I'll consider it, but I need to speak with my advisor first." "Of course," said Detective Haynes. "Here's my direct line. We'd appreciate your cooperation." She jotted down his number and ended the call, her heart thumping. If the police got involved, Julian could face criminal charges. This was more than she'd ever imagined. She quickly dialed Mr. Royce, explaining the development. He sounded both pleased and cautious. "That's potentially huge," he said. "If the police get involved, Julian might be indicted. That ups the ante in your divorce. Maxwell could strike a plea deal or try to spin the narrative, but be careful. Once it becomes a criminal matter, you might get pulled into depositions from prosecutors and defense attorneys. It could prolong everything." Catherine sighed. "I just want a fair settlement. I never asked to bring the police into this." Mr. Royce's voice softened. "Sometimes divorces with big financial stakes lead straight to criminal cases, especially if the spouse is playing fast and loose with the law." Catherine told him she'd wait for the forensic audit results before formally cooperating with the police. He agreed that was prudent. The last thing she needed was to get entangled in a separate legal battle. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that events were spiraling beyond her control. Meanwhile, the tension between Catherine and Julian escalated. One evening, Catherine was leaving her yoga class when she saw Julian waiting by her car in the dimly lit parking lot. Her pulse quickened. She considered walking back inside to call for help, but he held up his hands in a gesture of truce. "Catherine," he said quietly, "I just want to talk." She kept her distance. "Maxwell said never to talk to me without him, so this must be important." He exhaled, looking oddly weary. This has gone too far. The business, I'm hemorrhaging money. Investors are getting spooked by the headlines, and now the cops might come knocking. Let's settle this. No more audits, no more accusations. She felt anger flare. You can't just wave a check in my face and make me drop the truth. I wouldn't be doing any of this if you'd been honest from the start. He took a step closer, a pleading note entering his voice. We used to love each other. Remember, I can give you a generous settlement, more than you'd get even if you win in court, but let me save my reputation. Drop the claims, just walk away with the money. Catherine's eyes stung with tears of frustration. You're asking me to ignore your wrongdoing, to pretend those accounts do exist, just so you can salvage your empire. He pressed on, desperation creeping in. You'll never have to worry about money again. You can start a new life, do whatever you want. Isn't that what you wanted from this divorce in the first place? She shook her head. I wanted honesty, and at this point it's about more than just me. Wendy put herself at risk. People like Mr. Royce are investing their time because they believe in justice. I won't sell out and let you bury your crimes. His face hardened. Crimes is a strong word. Maybe the system is rigged, so we have to be creative in business. But that doesn't make me a criminal. Tell that to the judge, she snapped. He stared at her for a long moment. I see, you've changed, Catherine. You used to be more understanding. She swallowed. I'm still me. You're the one who changed. He turned away, hands clenched at his sides. So that's it then. Oh yes, she said quietly, that's it. Without another word, Julian stalked off into the darkness. Catherine watched him go, tears burning behind her eyes. She, once adored him, felt safe in his presence. Now he was a stranger, a wounded animal cornered by his own deceptions. As the next court date loomed, one that could see the final prenuptial challenge and spousal support determination, Catherine felt the pressure mounting. The forensic audit was ongoing, the potential criminal inquiry lurked in the background, and Maxwell was doubtless ready to unleash more legal theatrics. In the quiet of her apartment, she steeled herself by reviewing every piece of evidence, every statement from Wendy, every note from the forensic accountant. At last, the day arrived. The courthouse was buzzing with interest in that big divorce case. Catherine made her way through the crowds, taking her usual seat. Julian sat across the aisle, features grim. Maxwell busied himself with a stack of files, barely glancing at Catherine. Judge Wright took the bench, scanning the assembled parties. Today we'll address two primary issues: the prenuptial agreement's enforceability and the preliminary recommendations for spousal support and property division, given the forensic audit's findings. Mr. Brown, is your client prepared? Maxwell rose. Yes, Your Honor. However, we believe Ms. Fairchild's allegations of hidden assets remain unsubstantiated as the audit is not complete. Judge Wright frowned. Ms. Morgan's preliminary report already suggests unaccounted funds. Let's not dismiss that so lightly. She looked at Catherine. Ms. Fairchild, you've claimed the prenuptial agreement should be invalidated. Are you ready to present final arguments on that point? Catherine stood, summoning her composure. Yes, Your Honor. The agreement was signed without my full understanding just days before the wedding. I had no counsel. And we've seen that Mr. Fairchild did not disclose all his financial assets at the time. His hidden accounts show that the prenuptial was fundamentally based on incomplete information. Maxwell cut in. Objection. There's no conclusive proof that the accounts existed prior to the marriage. Judge Wright gestured for Catherine to continue. Catherine held up a document. We have date-stamped statements showing offshore transfers started shortly after we got married, but some shell corporations were registered in his name before the wedding. If those existed, they should have been disclosed. Judge Wright turned to Maxwell. That's a serious claim. Do you have evidence to refute it? Maxwell's face was stone. Your Honor, we maintain that these corporations were dormant. No funds were ever deposited until after the marriage, and the prenuptial agreement only covers active assets at the time. Judge Wright leaned back, mulling over both sides. In family law, full financial disclosure is paramount. Hiding or omitting information can indeed render an agreement unenforceable. Given the evidence, I am inclined to find that the prenuptial agreement does not fully govern this case. At minimum, it will require reformulation. Potentially, it could be set aside entirely. Catherine's heart leapt. Maxwell's jaw tightened so hard she thought it might crack. Julian bowed his head, a flicker of despair crossing his face. Judge Wright continued, moving on to spousal support. Ms. Morgan's preliminary findings indicate that Mr. Fairchild's net worth is significantly higher than what was initially disclosed. Ms. Fairchild's financial situation, by contrast, is modest. Until we finalize asset division, I'm increasing the temporary spousal support to $4,000 a month. Mr. Brown, your client is expected to comply. Maxwell made a pained expression. Your Honor, that's double the previous order. The judge's voice remained firm. It is. And if further evidence of undisclosed assets emerges, I may revisit the amount again. Now, regarding property division, we're not ready for a final allocation without the full audit, but I'll be very clear. Any assets discovered to have originated from the marital estate will be considered in the final distribution. A tense silence filled the courtroom. Catherine felt a wave of vindication, but also a hint of sadness. The unstoppable machine of Julian's empire was finally grinding to a halt under legal scrutiny. This was the path he had chosen by deceiving her, by refusing to settle fairly from the start. Judge Wright wrapped up the session with a pointed directive. Mr. Fairchild is to continue cooperating with Ms. Morgan's team. Our next court date will be set after the audit results are in. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck, and just like that, the air in the courtroom felt lighter, though it was an uneasy reprieve. Catherine gathered her things slowly, noticing Maxwell and Julian huddled in tense conversation. She caught bits of Maxwell's heated whisper, "We'll appeal, we can't let this stand." Julian looked pale, eyes flicking between Catherine and the exit. Catherine left without engaging them. Outside, the flashes of camera phones greeted her, a small throng of onlookers hungry for updates. She pushed past them, refusing to comment beyond a polite no statement. She just wanted to get away, to breathe. She won a significant victory, but the final battle was still pending, and something in her gut told her Maxwell had a final trick up his sleeve. That evening, Catherine's phone lit up with an incoming text from the detective at the Financial Crimes Unit, Samuel Haynes. "We've initiated an inquiry into Mr. Fairchild's finances. Some new evidence has come to us anonymously, referencing alleged bribery attempts. Would you be willing to talk soon?" Catherine stared at the message, her heart hammering. The safe deposit key in the clinic's lockbox might be the final piece of that puzzle. If the police were also receiving tips about Project Arbor, maybe it was only a matter of time before they cracked it open. She typed back, "Yes, let's schedule a meeting." She sank onto her couch, trying to process the whirlwind of events. Julian's downfall seemed all but certain, yet she felt only a hollow ache. The man she had once trusted implicitly had become an enemy, and now he faced potential criminal charges. She wondered if he ever regretted letting Maxwell turn the divorce into a battleground. Maybe if they'd parted amicably, none of this would have become so public. But as Mr. Royce often said, men like Julian rarely gave up control without a fight. She also worried for Wendy, who had heard from Maxwell's office that they intended to depose her again, possibly dragging out the process until she caved. Catherine resolved to stand by her no matter what. She sent Wendy a quick text just to check in. "How are you holding up?" Wendy replied with a simple "one day at a time," which made Catherine's chest tighten with sympathy. A month passed, marked by meticulous legal wrangling. The forensic auditors traveled to the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg, requesting records from banks that didn't easily comply with subpoenas from U.S. courts. Maxwell contested nearly every motion. Meanwhile, Detective Haynes met with Catherine and Wendy, carefully noting their testimonies about Julian's financial manipulations. Every day felt like a precarious balance. Catherine struggled with mounting legal fees. Though Mr. Royce was unpaid, there were filing costs, document fees, and the general expenses of daily life. The court-ordered spousal support helped, but she was always mindful that Maxwell might find a way to withhold it or tie it up in appeals. At last, a final hearing date was scheduled, with Judge Wright indicating her intent to wrap up the divorce if the forensic audit was sufficiently conclusive. The city buzzed with anticipation. Local media framed it as the showdown, pitting the unscrupulous businessman against his soon-to-be ex-wife who had uncovered his empire of lies. On the morning of the hearing, Catherine arrived at the courthouse in a dark green suit. She took a seat in the nearly packed gallery. The tension in the air was palpable. Maxwell shuffled his notes at the petitioner's table, Julian sitting stiffly beside him. Catherine noticed lines of stress etched into Julian's face that she'd never seen before. She felt an unexpected pang of sadness for him. Judge Wright entered, calling the court to order. Ms. Morgan was first to testify, delivering her final forensic audit report. She summarized her findings with painstaking clarity. After an exhaustive review, we've identified multiple offshore accounts connected to Mr. Fairchild that received funds originating from the couple's joint account. The total sum diverted is approximately $8 million over 3 years. In addition, there are indications of tax irregularities and mislabeled business expenses. Our conclusion is that a significant portion of these funds belong to the marital estate. A hushed gasp rippled through the onlookers. Julian's shoulders sagged. Catherine held her breath. Maxwell tried to counter, pointing out that some of the money might be legitimate investments, but Ms. Morgan held firm. If they were legitimate, they would have been disclosed appropriately and not disguised as operational expenses. Then the bombshell dropped. Ms. Morgan revealed she had cross-checked statements from a local official's accounts, discovering suspicious deposits that seemed to correlate with large withdrawals from Julian's shell corporations. These deposits suggest potential bribery or kickbacks, Ms. Morgan said. This is beyond the scope of the divorce, but it's in my report. A ripple of shock coursed through the courtroom. Judge Wright's eyes narrowed. She turned to Maxwell. Mr. Brown, do you have an explanation for why your client's funds appear in a local official's account? Maxwell looked rattled. Your Honor, we have no knowledge of these transactions. We suspect the forensic accountant is overstepping by alleging criminal activity. This is a civil matter. Judge Wright's voice was ice cold. Whether or not it's criminal, it impacts the integrity of these proceedings. If Mr. Fairchild attempted to influence officials to gain advantage in this divorce or his business dealings, it's highly relevant. Catherine exchanged glances with Mr. Royce, who sat behind her. It felt like the entire facade was crumbling. She noticed a detective standing near the back of the courtroom, likely Haynes, though she couldn't see him clearly, scribbling notes. The tension was electric. Finally, Judge Wright addressed the parties. I'm prepared to rule on this divorce, given the overwhelming evidence that Mr. Fairchild misled the court regarding his finances and that Ms. Fairchild is entitled to a fair share of these funds. Maxwell tried to request a continuance. Your Honor, we need time to address these new allegations of bribery. Judge Wright shook her head decisively. You've had ample time. This divorce has been drawn out enough. My ruling is as follows. The prenuptial agreement is set aside. We will divide the discovered marital assets equitably. Ms. Fairchild is awarded half of all disclosed and undisclosed funds that originated in the joint account, including any profits derived from them. As for spousal support, Ms. Fairchild will receive a lump sum payment in lieu of ongoing monthly support, calculated based on the valuation of the hidden assets. Mr. Fairchild is also responsible for Ms. Fairchild's legal costs pertaining to the forensic audit. A stunned silence filled the room. Catherine fought back tears of relief. She had won truly and unequivocally. Julian covered his face with his hands while Maxwell stood rigid, struggling to maintain composure. Judge Wright's gaze swept over the courtroom. This court strongly recommends that the pertinent authorities investigate the possibility of bribery or other wrongdoing. That matter is outside my jurisdiction, but I will forward Ms. Morgan's report to the appropriate agencies. Court is adjourned. With a crack of the gavel, it was over. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing. Catherine felt a wave of emotion, triumph, exhaustion, sadness for what she had lost, and gratitude for what she had gained, freedom and justice. Maxwell stared daggers at Catherine, then hurriedly conferred with Julian, whose face was ashen. Julian seemed to mutter something, maybe cursing the day Catherine ever stood up for herself. She took a deep breath, ignoring the cameras as she exited the courtroom. Wendy rushed up to her, tears in her eyes. "You did it," Wendy exclaimed. "You stood your ground." Catherine hugged her friend. "We did it. I couldn't have done this without you." Mr. Royce joined them, placing a hand on Catherine's shoulder. "Congratulations. The system worked for once." Catherine gazed across the hallway at Julian, who leaned against a marble pillar looking defeated. Maxwell was at his side, talking in urgent, hushed tones. For a brief moment, Catherine considered walking over to him, but she realized there was nothing left to say. He had made his choices, and now he had to face the consequences. Outside, the media frenzy was in full swing. Microphones were thrust toward Catherine. She gave a brief statement. "I appreciate the court's thoroughness. This was never about revenge. It was about fairness and honesty. I hope we can all learn something from this." Then she slipped into the sunlight, the warm day unfolding around her. A weight lifted from her shoulders. This chapter, this grueling, painful chapter, was finally closing. In the weeks that followed, the legal formalities of transferring funds and finalizing the divorce consumed Catherine's time. The city officials involved were placed under investigation, and rumors swirled that Julian might face criminal charges. Detective Haynes kept Catherine updated on a need-to-know basis, saying they were building a strong case for financial misconduct. She tried to stay out of it as much as possible, focusing on moving on with her life. One morning, she woke in her still small apartment and realized she didn't have to check her email for court notices or scramble through legal documents. She breathed in the calm, feeling a sense of wholeness she hadn't known in years. Yes, she had a substantial settlement coming once the paperwork cleared. That would give her financial security. But more importantly, she had reclaimed her identity. She called Wendy, who was cautiously optimistic about her own future, no longer fearing Julian's retaliation. She met with Mr. Royce for coffee, expressing her gratitude. He shrugged off her thanks. "I'm glad to see you find your strength," he said. "That's worth more than any legal victory." On a bright autumn afternoon, Catherine drove to a local art gallery. She had used some of her newly freed funds to rent a small storage space for the paintings she'd inherited from her mother. She intended to display them in a home she planned to buy once the settlement fully processed. Standing in the gallery, she took in the vibrant colors of the artwork on display. She felt alive and inspired, filled with a sense of possibility rather than dread. As she strolled through the gallery, she thought about the future. Maybe she'd go back to school or start a small business, something that aligned with the parts of herself she had neglected. She found herself smiling at the idea of forging a life based on her own choices, not overshadowed by someone else's ambitions and manipulations. That evening, she returned to her apartment and sat by the window sipping tea. The city lights shimmered below. She reflected on how a ruthless lawyer had once mocked her in court, how her ex-husband had tried to hide his secrets, and how she had almost lost faith in herself. Yet here she was on the other side of the storm. She closed her eyes, feeling the last remnants of tension loosen. The legal battles, the depositions, the hidden assets, the intimidation, everything was done. Yes, there might be aftershocks if criminal charges materialized against Julian, but Catherine's role was finished. She was free. Tomorrow, she would wake up and continue her new life, her own life. And that knowledge filled her with a peace she hadn't felt in a very long time.